I was in a little park, kind of a, not a park with a lot of trees and grass, but fountains that was right in front of the entrance of a pretty nice mall, multi-story mall. And I turned
Yeah.
around and looked up, and I saw that building that's that at the time I think was probably one of the highest buildings in that area. And it was the building seen in that famous photograph taken in late April 1975, where you've got a small helicopter landing on top of that building, and you have people scrambling up steps to get to that helicopter. This famous photo that kind of symbolizes the end of the Vietnam War. And I looked up and saw that building and was amazed. And just sort of, stood there for a while and actually returned to that spot a number of times, just looking at that building and what that site symbolized. But what I noticed every time I went is that I was the only one paying attention to it. I looked around, no one else is looking at the building, no one else is commenting on it. There were some English speaking tourists that walked by, and maybe from New Zealand or something. I pointed it out to them. They were polite, but obviously didn't care. So what I noticed is that no one in the park is looking at this historically really important site.
Hmm.
And but then I thought that there was a small sign that said something about April 30, 1975, indicating this is an important site. But it wasn't a particularly notable sign. Not a lot of attention. It didn't draw attention. And then I noticed that there was handwritten graffiti on the sign saying that actually April 30, 1975 was a dark day. But what struck me about that was, as I
So the
went back,
graffiti was saying that.
the graffiti
On,
was saying that in
oh, that's
English,
it.
this was a dark day. But what's interesting is I went back to that site repeatedly and over a space of a couple of years, I believe. Well, certainly on this one trip, I went back repeatedly, and the graffiti didn't get cleaned off. It was just on the sign.
Yeah.
So there are multiple surprises, but what draws all of this together is that my sense is that I was the only one who really cared. I was looking at this building thinking, wow, this is such a historically important site. But I didn't get the feeling that anyone else around me cared. I didn't get the feeling that the government particularly cared. There was the sign there marking it, but they didn't care enough to wipe off the graffiti that was there.
Right.
So I don't, so I guess I'm throwing all of this at you. Sort of this weird thing that, you're in the States and you talk to Vietnam veterans for whom this war is still present. It's with them every day. You even, I mean, you talk to Vietnamese living in the States, at least some of them, older
Yeah.
ones, for whom the
Right.
war is this daily presence. But then there I am in Saigon looking at this, really important site, and I just get the feeling that nobody cares about it, right? So
Yeah.
that's where I end. I'm wondering what response you have to that.
Well, I think that I mean, you recently had a conversation with one who translated Bao Nin's short story collection,
Yeah,
and reading that, I got the perspective of a kind of loneliness of the war veteran, from the North who has is still kind of very much living the traumas of the war, or whose sort of memories are just sort of soaked and doused in his experiences in the war, and the loneliness of that. And I think that that aptly captures the experiences of those that war in the war here now, because I think that I'm not surprised at the reaction. I think that from the perspective of the government, that building, doesn't hold much significance at all. And from the perspective of the young, right, it's the war is such a long time away, such a distance for them to consider. Um, I think that you would, if you can find sort of war veterans from the South that are still here, or those that are in America, then I think they would share that kind of experience, which is that kind of loneliness upon sort of coming back and seeing certain sites. My roommate, my former roommate, who is, born in Vietnam and went to school in America for his high school and then his college. He was I wrote about him very briefly in the book. And part of his research was interviewing veterans who come back and, trying to find sort of, parts and remnants. And it's sort of a little, sort of war tourism in some ways, right? But it's about like encountering that past again. And he thought, that was really interesting for him to know, because his father was, on the side of the North, and to get that experience. But I think that experience that you had is not unique. I think that those who come back looking for a kind of like reminders of the war, or just to look at pieces of the past that is historically important, and recognize that for the everyday folk that live here now, they have no kind of interest or recollection. I think they've kind of that past is so distant for them. It's interesting to me to see that the way that certain aspects of the war are still preserved in order to tell a kind of story, right? The Cu Chi tunnels are preserved to tell this kind of narrative, right? Of a kind of heroism, right? For those that sort of built it and lived there. So you do see remnants of the war that the government will say, ought to be preserved to tell that kind of narrative. But if you're talking about within the city itself, the past is diminishing very quickly, and the kinds of buildings like historical buildings are every day kind of being erased, and streets are reformed, right? So really, really big plans to kind of change the scope of the city and what it means. So I think that it's this kind of fervor for kind of economic progress, and I think it subsumes a lot of other things, a lot of other kinds of values. The pull of economics, the pull of just continuous progress, the idea that Vietnam or Ho Chi Minh City can become the next Singapore, the next Hong Kong, the next Taipei, like this, they see, I think the planners and the government see the potential for those things, and maybe those that dream overwhelms the desire to maybe preserve certain aspects of the city that I think are just so essential to it.
A few minutes ago mentioned Bao Ninh, the famous North Vietnamese veteran who wrote really the fantastic novel Star of War. And the loneliness of the veteran. I wonder if you sort of think of a hierarchy of loneliness among combat veterans, I wonder if those who were with the South, with the army of the Republic of Vietnam on the losing side, I wonder if they're even more lonely, because my sense is that, just to set up a scenario, let's say you have veterans of who fought with the North. Just the image I have in my mind is on the beach and at Nha Trang, the beach at Nha Trang at say 5 a.m. You've got a lot of people out on the beach exercising, and it's incredible the energy that's there at 5 a.m. on the beach at Nha Trang. But let's say that a group of guys who fought with the North meet there once a week, and they're swapping stories about what they remember from the war, and they understand no one else is, the young people don't really care, but they're talking among themselves. My sense is that veterans who fought with the South, I'm not sure that they would even do that kind of thing. So I guess I'm asking you what your gut sense is. When we think about sort of the loneliness of the combat veteran, these folks who have experienced things that are impossible to understand, I'm guessing that those who fought for the South probably even feel that more because their experience isn't something that they can talk about publicly. I think that's my guess. Is that
Yeah.
right? Or what's your thought about that?
I I know that I teach students now that, whose parents or grandparents are were a part of the war on both sides, in the North and the South. And whenever there's a discussion or something that relates to the war, every once in a while you hear stories kind of trickle through, and you hear like bits and pieces of it. But the recurring kind of narrative is that, oh, my grandpa doesn't talk about it. He was through it, and he just doesn't talk about it. So I do wonder if there's some truth to what you say, and that um it's both kind of taboo and maybe deemed seen as not productive, or I don't know, I would say dangerous. I think the government doesn't necessarily fear those kinds of stories from Southern veterans, but I don't think that they're shared amongst, the family, or talked about.
Hmm.
um so that I think, yeah, I think that there's certainly a kind of a levels of silence
Mhm.
that they have to experience and go through. um and I wonder if there's a more of a, almost kind of a freedom for those that are diaspora members, like Vitku, that have gone to America, um that are vets. There's like associations for those folks, and communities where they can have conversations and talk about what they went through, that might not be as much as the case here. My maternal grandfather went to re-education camps for a year, and he didn't really talk very much about that to his daughters. And when I left, I was just 8, so of course I never heard any stories about that until I started writing the book. And then I talked to my mom, and she said, "Oh yeah, he went for a year, and then he was just too old, and he was released to go back to civilian life." So yeah, I think that there might be gradations and different experiences in terms of how the war is kind of, lingers or traumatizes the South a little bit differently than those in the North.
Hmm. Do you feel that in any way, the fact that your family, at least so far as I'm recalling now, your family is with the South? I'll ask you about, something you bring up a number of times is your mom's nostalgia for Saigon, pre-75. And what I'm always thinking is, but the war, the war was going on for
Yeah,
20
right.
years, so I'm interested in that. You have a family member who was killed in the war, the hand grenade in the tank. You just mentioned your grandfather, I think it was. I mean, is it
Uh,
in any way at all, even in a slight way, any kind of a burden for you living in Vietnam now, being part of a family that was with the South, with the side of that war that lost? Or is that in any way at all a burden, or is it just not at all?
it isn't. I
Right.
think that the families North and South have, mostly kind of made peace with it here, to the degree that I think in terms of my mother's nostalgia, you know, I think she carries the traumas of war much more heavily. And even if she didn't participate, for
Yeah.
her, before the war ended, there was, of course, a lot of uncertainties. Both of her brothers were officers in the Southern Army, and her oldest brother, went to the States towards the tail end of the war. Go Hai, I wrote about him, and the two younger brothers were officers. So there was uncertainty about what would happen, but at least, from her perspective, they were still here. The family was still kind of together, still a unit. And if they were at the front, sometimes at least they were back for certain events. I wrote about my uncle three who passed away because of this errant like grenade that was left in his tank. And so I think for her, just knowing that the family was still kind of there. And
Mm,
I think after the war, everything changed just quite rapidly. I think um, the her father went to re-education camps. Her brother was still in America. Her oldest brother was still in America. Her second oldest brother passed away, and the youngest brother, was there, but very much like limited and restricted, and because he was an officer. So I think that things had changed so much for
mm,
her. She remembers the pre end of the war years with some fondness, and it's not. She was also, I mean, she recalls hearing sort of gunfire and cannons, right? Like that it was a frequent occurrence, but she was never at the front. She was in medical school. Her oldest brother was sending money back from the States so that she could go to medical school. Um, so she recalls it with nostalgia and with a lot of kind of, to some degree, sort of rose tinted glasses, and with a lot of fondness, because I think she feels that the community was still a bit she was surrounded by that community of friends and
yeah.
and family.
The
Yeah.
community was, so this makes sense. There's a war going on, and it comes to Saigon, especially during the Tet Offensive, um, but her family's together. Um, but she loses a brother in the war, right? But then after the South loses, that's when things kind of fall apart because the re-education camps, because at that time, obviously, having served with the South
Yeah.
brings pressure on you. You get to the mid 80s, and by the mid 80s, I mean, word's out that if you flee Vietnam, if that's the best verb to use, if you become a refugee and flee Vietnam, this is a really dangerous thing. I mean, a lot of the folks who flee Vietnam don't make it. The
Yeah.
stories about the pirates are out. There's no mystery. There's no secret that by the mid 80s, you could become victimized, not just by pirates who are going to pick your pockets, but by pirates who have a reputation of being quite brutal, and
Yeah.
murderous. Um, and so, what I want to ask you about, and so that's setting up a question that's coming around the corner, but what happens that what was it that drove your parents to the place where they were willing to do something that's pretty radical, and that's obviously quite dangerous. But before we get to that question, I want to ask about your dad. um I don't remember exactly, was your dad involved at all with the army of South Vietnam?
He was the one of the major doctors for a civilian hospital in the
Okay,
city,
right.
and
Yeah.
so he would treat mostly civilians, but sometimes army officers and so on if they sort of spilled over. Yeah.
So then when the
Yeah.
war ends, how, so then it sounds like he was not identified as, someone who had actively served with the enemy when the war was over.
Right, right. And so he was watched carefully, but I think it was very soon discovered that I think he was a good surgeon and he was allowed to continue to participate and work. And I think by the time we left, I think, I remember him telling me that he was work he a lot of his patients were pretty higher ups, people that were, because it was those were the folks that were coming through the hospital. So he was a pretty well known and respected physician by the time we escaped.
I see.
Yeah.
So what happens now? You're a kid, so you're a young, a young child. So I wouldn't expect you to have, detailed personal memories. But from what you do remember and what you've heard from the family, what happens? You go from a place where, we have fond memories of this world pre 1975. Now we're putting all of our lives at risk to
Yeah.
to flee. So you've said a little bit, the pressure that comes when the war is over, the re-education camps. This is, you say your dad has watched that, and that's, maybe it's kind of exhausting after a while if you feel like you're always being watched. Um, is that sufficient to bring your parents to the place of saying, well, we've got to get out of here, we've got to do something, really taking our lives into our hands? Or what else happened that drove them to that place that really was, I mean, they make a pretty desperate decision.
Yeah. It it was, and it was really my mom's decision. I think the original plan was for my mom to take me and for the two of us to go. And with the belief that my dad would eventually come later and follow. But here's the part of the memoir where I'm limited in terms of, knowing fully what was in my father's head and what he was thinking. I suspect that my dad didn't necessarily want to leave, and that my parents' marriage was having a lot of problems and issues. My mom was deeply unhappy because she couldn't practice at all. She was basically, she had to choose between raising me or, be sent away to kind of work down in the Delta.
He was a
And
doctor as well, right?
yeah, she's a doctor as well.
Yeah.
Um, and and she was deeply unhappy. She was going to go with me and and hopefully, start a new life there, with the understanding that my dad would come later. But I'm not entirely sure that, had he not come along ultimately, if that would have happened. And of course, when we made it to America, I think it was just 2.5 years afterwards, they separated and then they divorced maybe like 5 or 6 years later.
Mhm.
So I think that my mom knew that it was kind of an unsuccessful marriage. She was unhappy professionally. She was worried about me becoming, uh, and being educated in a way that was really quite restrictive. And she was concerned about that, and she made the decision to go. Now, the boat was owned by my father's friend, so my father knew that it was to some degree safer than if we were just to pay money to someone who was just kind of smuggle us out.
Mhm.
So my father felt secure in that, and we were traveling with some friends of my father's as well, and I mentioned that in the memoir. But I'm not entirely sure that he would have left. I think that he'll deny that. He'll say that no, I intended to go, as soon as I could, and so on. But I think, and in some ways, it showed in terms of when he was in America, because I think he, after the divorce, he had just such a period of sort of drifting and trying to find his place, to be kind of demoted from his role as a respected physician and surgeon to doing menial jobs and assisting with doctors and working at sort of the lowest levels in hospitals. So it was quite tough for him.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned your dad. Your mom had long experience with French and English, and so was able to, obviously, the French won't help that much in the States, but English obviously is a huge asset. You say that your dad never really got to the place where he was comfortable in English in the
Yes. Yeah. Even
States. Yeah,
today. Yeah. Even today,
yeah.
he's clearly much better than Vietnamese. Yeah.
So there's that, that I mean, tell me if you think this is right. This idea that, once we get out of this place, and then you go through a couple refugee camps. I'm interested in hearing your memories about that. My impression is that there's this idea that once we set foot in the US, then there's going to be a kind of magic, and everything's just going to be awesome.
Yeah.
But that's not how it turns out, because to make your way in the US, you've got to be able to function in English, at least in most parts of the US. For your dad, he's not able to master English. And so he goes, as you say, from being a respected doctor in Vietnam to to doing important work, but work that doesn't have the status of being a doctor. And
Yeah.
and you write about your mom not being real thrilled about the idea of you being back in Vietnam, but your dad goes back to Vietnam and is quite happy there, and
Mm.
gets along just fine there. Is that right? Do you think that there was an idea there that once we set foot in the States, it's going to be the land of Oz and everything's just going to be awesome? But it turned out to be a lot harder than anyone anticipated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in the refugee camps in Vietnam, before the refugee camps, that narrative is told over and over, right? Amongst the kids that are there, amongst the adults that are there. Um, I mean, life was tough in Vietnam, obviously, but I think that the there was just this prevailing belief that once you were out of the camps, once you were in America, once you were in France or wherever, whichever country took you in, um, then it would, the hard task is over. And I think you'll find that in many narratives of the diaspora or of those that are writing about the refugee experiences that in many cases, the troubles kind of are extended, or they get worse in some ways. In many ways, I think my family's or my parents' relationships was even more frayed and suffered once we were in America, more so than we were in the refugee camps and in
Mhm.
Vietnam in some ways, right? Because I think when we were there was a very clear goal for us to, we needed to kind of just wait and survive as a kind of a unit. But in America, all these different factors came into play, right? Being able to adjust, who is able to adjust quicker, who has command of the language. In this case, is going to be my mom. And the dichotomy, just the difference in terms of even just gender expectations, right?
Mhm.
He's the father in the family. He was the breadwinner in Vietnam, whatever little bread that was, right?
Mhm.
But he was the man of the house, and when that dynamic completely shifted,
Mhm.
then and we just kind of experienced, and I think it altered the family dynamic and a lot of other things beside, and the loneliness. I mean, the sheer loneliness of us settling in Toledo, Ohio.
How old are you when your family um, leaves
I was
Vietnam?
eight. I was eight when we left, and I turned 9 in the refugee camps.
In the refugee camp. So I'm wondering if you could just share some of the memories. I don't know as an 8-year-old if you're going to have as you bring these memories to mind, if you're going to have a running film or if it's more of snapshots, as you think about the time on the boat, the time in the camps. How long were you on the boat? How long was your family on the boat from Vietnam to
We
the
were there
refugee?
for about 9 days, nine to 10 days. I can't remember exactly. I think my mom
Sure.
would say 9 or 10 days. Yeah, as well.
You tell a story that you're asking, where are we going? And I think your dad says you're going to grandpa's house. You're just
Right.
taking a different route. Doesn't take long for that story to fall apart. And you describe this situation where you think you're on a river, but it's just the hugest river, that you've ever seen. You can't even see the horizon. Of course, you're out in the Pacific Ocean. Um, and you're told, so you ask again, when are we going to get to grandpa's house? And your parents say, well, actually, we're not going to grandpa's house, we're fleeing. And then the story you tell is that, if I remember it right, that you begin to cry and you say you don't want to die.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any sense of, how is it that an 8-year-old kid knows that if I'm on a boat with folks from Vietnam, that there's a chance of me dying? I mean, were these stories just kind of pervasive of what was happening as, the boat people, as they were called here in the States, as they're fleeing Vietnam in huge numbers? Do you assume that those stories were just so pervasive that you had picked that up?
Yes, I mean, I think in the news as well as in sort of family conversations, um, it was pervasive, and I think that it was to it was to the country's advantage that it was pervasive
Mhm.
for people that wanted to leave to hear about either arrests, storms, and deaths and so on. And I knew one friend of the family, close friend of the family, who was lost at sea, because I don't know I can't recall what context it came to me in, but it might have just been conversations among the adults about oh, he didn't make it, and there was a storm when he and his family was out. It was a doc. He was a doctor, so Dr. Dian, and I think we just that his example just came to my mind right away, because I remember he was fit, and he was strong, and he could swim, and like just all these things. For a little kid, you just think, well, if he couldn't do it, if the storm took him, then what's going to happen to us? So yeah, and the news was playing a lot of these items, and so on. So yeah, I was very aware right away when they told me that. And I knew when they told me that they had been lying to me for a reason, right? I knew that they were trying to make it feel like it was safer than it really was.
Yeah. I want to ask you, what some of this particular memories you have, what those are. But first, as you look back on, it's just 9 days, but it's a pretty heavy 9 days, on
Yeah.
that boat, and then the refugee camps. How would you say that that experience, those 9 days on the boat, perhaps maybe especially focusing on those 9 days on the boat, but maybe also the refugee camps as well, kind of this time of uncertainty. What lifelong impact has that had on you as you've, moved through life, gotten in well into adulthood now, reflecting on life? What lifelong impact do you think that that experience has had on you?
I think it gave me an incredibly strong sense um, of the fates, and of the 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 smallness, that human beings, fragility of human beings.
Mm,
And even at that age, I knew that we could do as much as we could try as much as we want, right? We could be as intrepid as we are, as we could be, the best crew and the best team on that boat. Um, and we could still be overtaken by a storm, or we could be overtaken by pirates. It was just not something that we could be in control of. I just felt, and even at that age, I just kind of, or in years to follow, I had that sense that we were incredibly, incredibly lucky to
mhm.
have made it through that experience. And that to some degree, yes, we are reliant and dependent on our adults to be strong and to keep us safe. Um, but we weren't. We were at the mercy of the sea, and of the storms, and of the weather, and of whether or not there were pirates in the area. And we were lucky to run into an oil rig, and so they dropped down some supplies. They pointed us in the right direction. I think this was the fourth or fifth day, so kind of midway through the trip, when we were running out of water. And we were lucky to survive the storm, and not have anything. And we were incredibly, incredibly lucky not to have run into pirates. that's just a major thing. I think that my mom or my dad mentioned that the captain was quite good at sort of navigating and guiding, and we, our boat didn't suffer any damage from the storm. So I think, but I think if there's one aspect of my life that I can that I can take away from that, it's just this strong sense of acknowledgement of fragility
Mhm.
and of luck, and that um I think if anything, it makes me sort of treasure um the moments of my life much more. I think there was one moment
Mhm.
after the storm. I wrote about this at the end of the book when my parents, my dad in particular, said, "Hey, let's just take a swim because we're now out of the purview of communist Vietnam." He said, "This is our first, free swim in free waters," and my dad was friends with the owner of the boat, so they allowed us. We were the only family to do this, and it was so foolhardy, like
Mhm.
it was just a foolish thing to do.
Yeah.
Um, we got on the coracle and we paddled out and swam a little bit, and that was alternately terrifying but thrilling for me at the same time, to swim in that water, and to recognize that I was just nothing. I was just this
Mhm.
little piece of fleck on the ocean. Um, you know, Both terrifying and thrilling. I mean, it was a thrilling experience that I'll mark for the rest of my life for sure.
So your ship gets through the storm, come across the oil rig, the guys on the oil rig, they give you supplies, point you in the right direction. As you think about those 9 days, you mentioned swimming once your dad feels safe, the idea of swimming in free waters. Yeah, it's an interesting image. Um, what other things stick in your mind the most as you think about those 9 days on the boat?
Um, I remember sort of flying fish,
Hmm.
uh, very well, because we also, that was a way for us to eat for a while. Like we just went in right in their direction, or they were around us, and I remember that, and I think
The flying fish landing in the boat and basically becoming food.
yeah, I mean, I remember it that way, and I don't know if I'm sure there were nets lowered and things, that happened. I just remember, encountering them, and this kind of like this image of just, them flopping around and on the deck, and
Yeah.
people so happy, that we had some food. Um, I remember, you know, uh, going into land for the first time, at Pulau Matak, and then a little bit later on Pulau Galang. Um,
And these are in
I
Indonesia.
Yeah, yeah, and I remember. I also just remember watching, watching the water, even just the rain on the water, and watching sunsets. I watched a couple of those, and I think the memories are so much less traumatic than the reality.
Hmm.
And I think that is, first, it's my 8-year-old self kind of just processing things, and I think it's just my parents, maybe telling the narrative in a certain way or protecting me from certain experiences on that boat, that made it so that allowed me to kind of almost idealize the trip in this way, because I can recall sunsets, and I can recall the nights of looking up and seeing the stars, and
Hmm.
I can recall the fish, that landed on the boat. Like these are kind of almost kind of miraculous, kind of cartoonishly gorgeous pictures in my mind. And in many ways they are, right? If you were to take a cruise trip or whatever, these are sites that you would see perhaps if you were that close to the water. Um, but they are that way, I think, because my parents were able to shield me from a lot of the horrors of that trip.
Hmm.
I barely remember, for example, the like just throwing up. And my dad said that I was just during the storm, everyone was throwing up in the hold, and it was just this stinking, horrific kind of environment. But I barely remember that. I just remember the aftermath of that, when my dad was able to take me above deck and was in the cabin with the captain. And the three of us just kind of sitting there. I do remember watching the waves, which were still kind of threatening. And I still remember being, again, both thrilled but horrified and sort of scared
Mm.
at the size of them, and the way that we were kind of cresting and going through them and
Wow.
yeah.
What do you remember about pulling into a place on land and arriving in Indonesia? Do you have recollections of that? Of getting off the boat?
Yeah, I have recollections of getting off the boat and kind of playing in the sand a bit. I also recollect seeing land for the first time, and that it wasn't like a happy occasion. And this was the island before Pulau Matak, when we got to an island. I asked my dad and my mom, neither of them can recall the
Mm.
name of the island, but like the police or the army, or the Navy, I guess, for Indonesians there, they came out and they were shooting in the air. I just remember just being really scared. And they were just telling us, you can't go here. It's not for you. And then we kept going. But I just remember being really scared and really horrified, and at the sound of gunfire, and that they were very angry for some reason. And
Wow,
then we just departed, and we just left, and we kept it going.
just kept going.
Yeah.
And so at the next place you go, then, is there a different reception? Or
Yes. Yeah. And we were at Flamatak, I think. I think just staying there for one night before we were given directions to go to Pulau Galang, which was where the refugee camps were.
okay.
So I think that was the island. It was a nearby island to Pulau Galang. And my mom says that when when we when we first got to Galang, there was a UNHCR HCR officer who came and like gave all of us like the little cartons of milk, and I just gulped it. I just gulped it up, and I asked for more. And she said that was the moment when she realized that we were going to finally be safe.
What distinct memories do you have of the camp in Indonesia?
Well, I remember, we were there for 5 months, going on to almost 6 months, and I remember fragments as well, but I think that there are, again, pretty happy fragments. I remember joining the Boy Scouts there because the Vietnamese refugees sort of, did a program for kids just to sort of keep us occupied. I remember playing in the beach a lot.
Mm.
I remember the barracks pretty well. I remember the feeling of being in the barracks, that crowded barracks with all those people. And you know, I I liked that. The funny thing is, I remember that in contrast to being in my own room when we finally made it to America in Toledo. And I just remember that, maybe because of its contrast, I just remember missing being surrounded by people like that, because that was
Mm.
how it was in that massive, massive bear. Um, and yeah, and I remember, I wrote about this as well, just going to get water from the stream and bathing there, and and coming back, and the kind of setup for that. I remember the community room where we watched, like, VHS videos every once in a while. So like the UNHCR was trying to have some kind of a life there, create some kind of a life there for us. And I think there were many people who stayed there for a long, long time, and they had to kind of make a life there, even in this kind of this land of limbo. You know, so it became in many ways like a community, and it was you know, and everyone had the shared experience of having been through this kind of harrowing experience on the sea. um you know, so in that sense it had that sense of community. You know, and my mom says that they were playing, you know, they had video like players to play some old music, you know, nhạc vàng and things like that, and
Hmm.
which you weren't allowed to play, you know, in Vietnam. So
Because it
so
was old
she
South Vietnamese music.
right.
Okay.
So she just remembered, you know, just that kind of experience quite fondly. And then she was
Hmm.
occupied all the time. She was, you know, teaching English. My dad was working in the clinic as a doctor. So you know, they were pretty occupied while there.
Did your parents did they um make an effort to get to the US, or was that assigned to them? Because I know some refugees will go to France, others will go to Canada and the Netherlands and so on. Was this you know, something that they specifically wanted to move to the US?
Yes. I mean, I think that was the first choice for both of them. And my mom had a sort of a second cousin who is living in Toledo, Ohio, and she um got connected with through the church with Bill and Kathy. And Bill and Kathy agreed to be our sponsors for the first 3 months. And I think once that was finalized, we were allowed to fly there,
Yeah.
because we had, you know, we had a cousin and we had a sponsor for us to go there.
In your memoir, you describe yourself. I mean, once you are into adulthood, you can still get around in Vietnamese. I mean, and you probably understand it without much difficulty, but you describe yourself as having a difficult time communicating in a fluent way in the language. So
Mm.
how did that happen? Did you and your mom talk to each other in English at home since your mom had a command of the language? How did that happen that um you know, it's this weird situation, and I know that your parents split up, but your dad never gets comfortable in English. You become somewhat uncomfortable in Vietnamese, and so that you describe
Yeah.
you and your dad trying to communicate and maybe, you know, speaking a mix of English and Vietnamese, but having a difficult time communicating. How did that happen that, you know, you got to a place where um Vietnamese became somewhat difficult for you?
Well, we were in Toledo, Ohio, and I was
Hmm.
really eager to assimilate. I was really wanting to, you know, become a part of the just a regular American boy, you know, in my school. So I was, you know, I was practicing it. I was reading. I was a voracious reader of whatever I could get my hands on, because I was still very shy in terms of like speaking English, knowing that I sounded wrong, that I didn't have that accent, or that I had the accent, a Vietnamese accent still.
Hmm.
Um, I retained my Vietnamese comprehension in terms of listening comprehension for a good long time, because I think, well, my parents kept speaking to me in Vietnamese, and I would gradually start to respond back to them in a mixture of English and Vietnamese, and then just English altogether. So the conversations were usually, you know, I would speak to them in English and they would speak to me in Vietnamese. My mom would start to mix in English every now and then, but my dad was, at least when he was still with us, was speaking almost entirely in Vietnamese. So my listening comprehension was still pretty good, but my writing and my reading was gone very quickly, and my speaking skills, my vocabulary, was greatly diminished very soon
Right.
after starting school.
How long
Yeah.
have you lived in Saigon now?
This is my 7th year, but I was making quite a few trips back, and I was spending a lot of summers here when I was living in Hong Kong.
has that old, ability to, that childhood ability you had to communicate freely in Vietnam, in Vietnamese, has that come back now?
Yeah, my wife is local Vietnamese, so we speak entirely in Vietnamese.
Oh,
Um, I would love to say that my writing and reading skills have come back, but I don't practice it. I don't have an opportunity to unless I
uh,
force myself to. So I think in terms of my writing skills and my reading skills, I'm probably still, I don't know, a fourth grader or fifth grader. Um,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but I can speak and I can understand pretty
Yeah.
fluent.
You mentioned somebody in the memoir, a Vietnamese who had lived a long time in Australia. And I think the person is described as someone who doesn't identify really as Australian, doesn't really identify even as Vietnamese, but identifies more as Saigonese, as a person of Saigon. What's your own sense of self? You're a child in Vietnam, but then you grow up in the States, and as you just described, in the process of growing up in the States, you lose to a significant degree the ability to speak that language that you knew as a child, that you've recaptured it as an adult. Live a long time in the States, speak English now with just a standard American accent. Um, you're reading Western literature, but now you've made the choice to live in Saigon. What's your own sense of self? How do you describe yourself in the world?
That's a great question to end on. I
Yeah.
I see myself in the world, specifically in this place right now, as a Vietnamese, as a Saigonese person in Saigon, in this particular moment. And I think that changes, and it can change if we relocate to America, as we will at some point as a family. Because I'm also essentially American as well. So
Mm,
I think that so much of my of who I am is defined by the time that I've spent in this climate, this land, um, and that includes this 7 years that I've come back here and kind of lived here, but it also includes my childhood here. And I think that the the childhood experience is so essential for building a sense of self, a sense of who you are in the world, that even if Saigon is so different now, even if it's inalterably changed, that kind of is the essence of my years here, those years with like rolling blackouts, with
mm,
when people were mostly on bicycles, and there was like it was just so essential to me. And so I've gone through, like the monsoon season, that and firecrackers, like
mm,
all of those things are such essential parts of my identity. And I could say that that's Vietnamese, but when I say that that's Vietnamese, I don't think of it as like the government of Vietnam, or the Communist Party of Vietnam. It's For me, it's essentially more, it's baked into maybe land and geography and family and essential friendships, and the experiences that I had during that time. So I can say, with some certainty that I am Vietnamese, and I'm Vietnamese living in Saigon right now. And I don't think that would be dishonest, but I think it would be incomplete, because I think that if you find me living in Boston, I can very much say that I'm an American living here in Boston.
mm.
So I take both parts of my identity um, with me wherever I go. But I think that in this moment, I feel very, very Vietnamese. I feel very, very Saigonese in particular, because of how connected I am to this city, and how much I love it here. I can't promise that I'm going to be here for good, or for the immediate future, but I feel a kind of a deep sense of a connection to this place.